In today's video, we will be looking at the horrific case of Suzanne von Richthofen. So sit back and let's open the case file. In 2002, the Suzanne von Richthofen case gripped Brazil. In the year when the nation's football team won the Football World Cup against Germany in Japan, this football-mad country's main talking point turned from football to Suzanne von Richthofen. I say football, but those of you from North America, I am of course referring to soccer. 1983 in São Paulo. She had a German father and a Brazilian mother. Her father was an engineer named Manfred Albert von Richthofen, and her mother, Mauritia, was of Lebanese descent. Her father was the director of the State Company for Highway Development in São Paulo, and her mother was who was born in 1987. Suzanne studied at a German high school before moving on to study law at a Catholic university in São Paulo. She was described as happy but a little shy. Suzanne was known to have a very good relationship with her parents and her brother. They all lived together in a comfortable house in a gated community in the Campo Belo neighborhood of São Paulo. She was well educated, pretty, and had parents with an estimated wealth in 2002 of $5.5 million. In the summer of 1999, she started practicing Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, where she got to know Daniel Cravinhos de Paulo da Silva, who soon became her boyfriend. Suzanne's parents at first allowed her relationship with Daniel, but soon changed their opinion of him when they discovered that he used marijuana almost daily. He did not work or attend college and did not come from a particularly good neighborhood. In July 2002, her parents were on vacation, so Daniel moved in with Suzanne for a month, much to her delight. When her parents returned home, Suzanne suggested that they buy her a flat in which she could live with Daniel, but her father refused, saying that she could do whatever she liked, only if she earned money herself. Suzanne's relationship with Daniel started to put a strain on her relationship with her parents. Her parents pressured her to break off the relationship, but she refused. They then threatened to cut off her allowance. On the night of the 31st of October, 2002, Suzanne took her brother to a cyber cafe to meet friends and play video games. Then Suzanne, along with her boyfriend Daniel and his 26-year-old brother Christian, went to her home. Earlier that evening, she had deactivated the burglar alarm and turned off the video security cameras, and drove into the garage. Her boyfriend Daniel and his brother Christian put on hoods and entered the house. She entered first, going up the stairs to her parents' bedroom, turned on the light in the hall, and verified that her father and mother were asleep. She went downstairs and sat on the couch. The brothers went upstairs to the parents' bedroom and hit her parents with iron bars. Did not die quickly, despite suffering severe brain trauma. To finish them off, Daniel ran to the bathroom and came back with 2 wet towels. They put them over their victims' faces in an attempt to drown out the sounds they were making, but this didn't work. So Daniel went to the kitchen and returned with a jug of water and attempted to drown Suzanne's parents. This managed to kill her father Manfred, but at this point her mother, Mauritia, was still alive. So they tied her head in a plastic bag until she finally suffocated. Once it was over, Suzanne came upstairs to see for herself that her parents were dead. The 3 of them then put the second stage of their plan into action by making the scene look like a break-in. They poxed money they found and spread papers over the house, creating a mess. This part of the plan was not executed well, as they left valuables, cell phones, and a gun, all of which are things burglars would be unlikely ever to leave behind. They did, however, take the family's stash of cash, a considerable amount of money in both US dollars and euros. Then they left. Daniel and Suzanne checked into a motel to establish an alibi, and Christian went to a fast food restaurant. Just before 3 in the morning, they checked out of the motel, and Suzanne dropped her boyfriend off and picked up her little brother Andreas, then aged 15, at an internet cafe and went home, where they discovered the crime. They instantly called the police. The investigating officers, however, doubted that this was a burglary that had gone wrong and very quickly thought that it had been committed by someone known to the victims. They soon began to question the children and the employees of the Richthofen family. What made them suspicious was not only the crime scene, the alarm system switched off, and papers spread very regularly and as if by design, but also the extraordinary coolness of Suzanne, who was seen in the house swimming pool with Daniel the day after the murder and who celebrated her 19th birthday with friends just hours after her parents' burial. The investigators focused their attention on Suzanne and her boyfriend. The clue for the arrest came with Christian, who had bought a motorcycle a few days later and paid cash in $100 bills. A few days later, on November 9, 2002, he was arrested along with his brother Daniel and Suzanne. Suzanne very quickly broke down and confessed to the murder. The investigation was concluded within a week. The case generated massive media attention in Brazil due to the stark contrast between the brutal crime and the personality of Suzane. While the brothers fitted the usual profile of the uneducated, unemployed, drug-addicted killers, this was not true for Suzane. She was a pretty blonde girl from an upper-middle-class family of German and Lebanese descent. Well-behaved, always doing well at school, speaking 3 foreign languages and doing ballet. The contrast between her affluent upbringing and the cruelty of a crime shocked the nation. The Brazilian public questioned whether Suzane was the evil mind behind the crime or just Daniel's tool. Many people who initially were emotionally on Suzane's side changed their opinion when a TV interview with her was shown. Before the interview took place, the cameras had already started rolling, and she was instructed to cry out loud during the broadcast so it would create public sympathy. In the end, however, the interview was a major blow for her credibility. In July 2006, almost 4 years after the murders, Suzane, along with Daniel and Christian, were put on trial in São Paulo for first-degree murder. On trial, Suzane blamed Daniel for everything, while the brothers claimed that they acted upon her desire. In court, Suzane was very cool, without emotion, while the brothers were crying most of the time. On one occasion, she even started to laugh. Suzane claimed she did it all for love, for fear that Daniel would leave her if her parents were not killed. Her lawyer said that Suzane had no motive at all to kill, but was forced to the crime by Daniel, whom she adored like a god. Another part of the motive may have been the parents' wealth, which Suzane would inherit in the event of the parents' death. The prosecution said that Suzane wanted to get her hands on the money and assets of her parents, and she wanted freedom and independence without having to work for it. On trial, her defense lawyer claimed that Suzane was physically violated by her father, which she and her brother Andreas deny. It was also claimed that Suzane's parents were alcoholics, but the autopsy found no alcohol in their bodies. The prosecution called Suzane the mastermind of the crime. They demanded 50 years imprisonment for each of the 3 defendants. Suzane was described as a personification, the evil blonde. On July 22, 2006, Suzane was sentenced to 40 years in prison for the crime. Daniel, her boyfriend, received the same sentence, and his brother Christian was sentenced to 38 years for conspiracy. In 2009, Suzane tried to get her sentence changed to house arrest. Her appeal was denied. She then tried again 2 years later. The same result. In 2011, her younger brother Andreas sued his sister for her half of the inheritance, including the money paid out on her parents' life insurance. He won. Today we are going to France to look at the absolutely terrible crimes of Guy Georges, also known in Paris as the Beast of Bastille. So sit back and let's open the case file. Guy was first registered as Guy Rampillon after his birth to a single mother at Vitré-la-Française, eastern France, on October 10, 1962. His birth certificate states that he was born in the central city of Anjou on the 15th of October of the same year. But this is incorrect. His father is described as Inconnu, which means unknown, although it is now established that he lived with Guy's mother for some time and was an American soldier named George Cartwright who worked as a cook on the NATO bases. Guy's mother, Helene, abandoned him to state custody at the age of 6 because she wanted to marry a U.S. serviceman and emigrate to California, where she lives today. She took with her another son, Stefan, who was 3 years older than his brother and conceived with another American serviceman. Guy's mother, Helene, was from a French military family. Her father was a retired NCO, and he fostered his daughter's first child, Stefan, until she emigrated. But he refused to foster Guy. For him, it was bad enough that his daughter had produced 1 child out of wedlock due to her fascination for Americans in uniform. But in her small town of Anjou, there was a social stigma attached to a woman who has had 2 children without being married. By this time, Guy was 6 years old, and he was taken in by the French Social Welfare Service to be placed with a foster family. In an attempt to aid his adoption, he was given the surname Georges after his father. He was adopted by a family named Morin, and grew up in a family of 12 adopted children. The young Guy never really received the love and attention and stability he needed, and soon began to show a violent and aggressive streak. At the time in France, the condition of a foster family was to issue a new birth certificate with false details to prevent the child from discovering their origins. This procedure was used for decades, but now in France it is eventually banned, as it is against basic human rights. Guy would go through the next 32 years of his life wondering who his father was. Guy was very close to his Catholic foster mother, who was rewarded in France for bringing up 12 foster children in addition to 7 of her own. But in pre-adolescence he began to steal from the family food store, more significantly acquired a knife to hunt and kill animals in the countryside behind his village home. By the age of 16 he had attacked 2 of his foster sisters, not for sexual reasons, but was sent to the state orphanage for adolescents. At 17 he was jailed for stealing a woman's handbag after ripping her face open with a knife. For this he went to prison. A month after his 19th birthday, Guy committed his first rape. It was now the 16th of November, 1981, and he attacked a neighbor named Natalie when she was returning home. He raped her, stabbed her, and left her for dead. Incredibly, Natalie survived the attack. His next known crime was committed on the 7th of June, 1982, in a car park where but again she managed to escape and she went to the police. A few days later, Guy was arrested and sentenced to 18 months in prison. He was released in early 1984, and soon after his release he attacked a 21-year-old girl named Pascal, again in a car park. He raped and stabbed her. She managed to break free and run away. Later that evening, police again arrested Guy. The French sentenced him to 10 years in prison. Guy was undoubtedly a person who was a danger to women. But duty is good behavior, but French court allowed him out of prison during the day. But he was required to report back each evening to spend the night in the cell. On the evening of the 24th of January, 1991, Guy did not report back to prison and instead traveled to Paris. He spotted an attractive young woman walking down the road. It was 19-year-old Pascal Escafel, a student at the Sorbonne. He followed her home and grabbed her as she was opening her front door. Holding a knife to her throat, he forced his way in, tied her up, and raped her before slitting her throat and watching her die. A week after the murder, Guy calmly returned to prison as if nothing had happened. Just over a year later, he was released from prison and wasted no time in finding another young female victim. On the 22nd of April, 1992, just 18 days after his release, he attacked a young French female named Eleanor, who escaped and reported the incident to the police. Guy was arrested once more and again returned to prison. At the end of 1993, even though Guy had attacked a young lady 18 days after his release from prison, the French authorities amazingly decided that he should be allowed back into society. Guy took no time to start his crime spree again. On January 7, 1994, Guy attacked 27-year-old Catherine Rock in an underground parking garage. He raped and murdered her. He struck again. His victim was a French radio host named Annie, who he raped and murdered on the patio of her home. Guy then stopped killing for 10 months. But then on the November 9, 1994, in the underground parking garage of 22-year-old Elsa Bennett's home, he raped and killed her. A month later, the December 10, 1994, he raped and murdered a 33-year-old Dutch architect named Agnes Nitschkamp in her home. The media began to report a killer in East Paris. In June 1995, Guy attacked another young lady named Elizabeth Ortega, and despite his best attempts to kill her, she made a narrow escape. She did this by climbing through a ground floor window of her flat. After having a lengthy conversation with him before he could assault her, she went to police and managed to give a vague description of her attacker. However, when she was eventually shown a picture of Guy, she failed to identify him. A few days later, on the July 8, 1995, he raped and murdered 27-year-old Helena Frinking in her apartment after she returned from an evening out. His lust for rape and murder was now out of control, and a few weeks later he assaulted another young French girl named Melanie, again in Paris. The media gave all the attacks a lot of coverage, and pressure was now on the police to find the culprit. The police, however, were failing. It was the press that alerted the country on the similarities between the murders. Journalists invented the description, the Bastille Killer, because 2 cases were located near the monument, and the authorities were eventually forced to accept that they had a serial killer on the loose. It was claimed that the police didn't even question Helena Franklin's neighbors about the murder until 23 months after she was killed, and Elizabeth Ortega was shown a picture of her attacker over 2 years after she was attacked. So it's no wonder she failed to recognize him. It is also claimed that police ignored accurate descriptions from other survivors and witnesses. Some claim that the police were distracted in Paris due to the 1995 Paris metro bombing and the 1997 investigation into Princess Diana's death, when the entire force was mobilized to satisfy public opinion. On the September 23, 1997, Guy broke into the apartment of 19-year-old student Magali Serrati, and he raped and stabbed her to death. She was killed in the late afternoon on her return from work in the flat where she lived with her fiancé. They were planning to get married in the spring and her wedding dress was in the wardrobe. 5 days later, Guy assaulted a young French woman in the stairwell of her apartment block. Luckily, she managed to run away. His crimes continued, and less than a month after, on November 16, 1997, Guy entered the home of 25-year-old Estelle Magth. He raped and murdered her. The police investigation was finally gaining impetus, and investigators knew for certain that several of the unsolved crimes were linked and that they potentially had a serial killer on their hands. The media frenzy surrounding the killings had unleashed a level of panic in the population of Paris. Everyone now knew of the Beast of Bastille due to the fact that several of his attacks had occurred in this quarter of Paris. It was one of the largest manhunts in French criminal history. Police finally found Guy in Montmartre and arrested him on March 27, 1998. It transpired that his DNA matched that found on 4 crime scenes as well as 1 attempted rape. Confronted while in custody with this irrefutable DNA evidence, Guy confessed of these 4 murders as well as 3 others. He was kept in custody but tried to escape in December 2000. Weeks before his trial was due to begin, he and 3 cellmates attempted to saw through the bars of the cell but were caught by prison guards. Before his trial, Guy was assessed by psychiatrists and he was declared legally sane. The media were all over the trial. They questioned how the French prison system that had diagnosed him as extremely dangerous nearly 20 years before had continually released him on the streets without treatment, money, or meaningful care. The media surmised, but Guy's attempts to find out who his father was caused him stress. Before the trial began, the original birth certificate was released and Guy was finally told his father's name and nationality. When he learned that his father was from the USA, it was as if he had been reborn. He leapt with joy. He retrieved the identity that he had been looking for all of his life. His father was from the USA, and knowing this raised his self-importance and self-confidence. The 3-week trial began on Monday, the 19th of March, 2001. The 50 witnesses included 4 women previously attacked and raped by Guy, members of the families of some of his victims, and his 71-year-old foster mother. Despite the prosecutor presenting the DNA evidence as well as the confession given after his arrest, Guy pleaded not guilty to all charges. He retracted his confession, claiming the police had tortured and beaten it out of him. 8 days into the proceedings, a defeated Guy broke down in tears and confessed. He admitted the original 4 murders as well as the rape and murder of Helena Franklin in 1995, Magali Serrati in 1997, and Estelle Magth in 1997, asking forgiveness from the victims' families. On Thursday, April 5, 2001, Guy Georgius, by now 38 years old, was sentenced to life, possibility of parole after 22 years. This means that the people of Paris may see Guy Georges back on their streets in 2023. Today, we will be visiting Victorian England and looking at the terrible crimes committed by possibly England's most prolific serial killer, Amelia Dyer. Amelia was born in 1838 in a small village of Pyle Marsh just east of Bristol. Bristol, for those of you unfamiliar with England, is on the River Severn, which separates England from Wales and is about 120 miles from London. Amelia was the youngest child of Samuel and Sarah Hobley and had 3 brothers and a sister. Her father worked as a master shoemaker. In her early years, she was a good student and very much liked literature and poetry. Sadly, during this time her mother suffered mental illness caused by typhus. Amelia witnessed her mother's violent fits and she cared for her mother until her mother's death in 1848. After her mother's death, Amelia went to live with an aunt in Bristol for a while and found work as a corset maker. And her eldest brother Thomas inherited the family shoe business. In 1861, at the age of 24, Amelia became permanently estranged from at least one of her brothers, James, and moved into lodgings in Trinity Street, Bristol. There she married George Thomas. George was 59, so 35 years her senior, so they lied about their ages on their marriage certificate to reduce the age gap. George deducted 11 years from his age and Amelia added 6 to hers. After her marriage, Amelia trained as a nurse. In Victorian Britain, this was considered a respectable occupation and enabled her to acquire useful skills. Life as a nurse, however, was hard. So through a contact with a midwife named Ellen Dane, Amelia learned an easier way to earn a living. Amelia started using her own home to provide shelter for young, unmarried women who were pregnant illegitimately and then farming off the babies for adoption or allowing them to die of neglect and malnutrition. Ellen Dane was forced to decamp to the USA shortly after meeting Amelia to escape the attention of the British authorities. In 1834, the Poor Law Amendment Act was passed, which meant that the fathers of illegitimate children no longer had any financial obligation to provide for the mother of the child. This made life very difficult for young, unmarried mothers and helped the growth of the practice known as baby farming, in which people such as Amelia Dyer acted as adoption or fostering agents in return for regular payment, or a single upfront fee from the baby's mothers. Took in young women and cared for them until they gave birth. The mothers subsequently left their unwanted babies to be looked after as nurse children. The predicament of the parents involved was often exploited for financial gain. If a baby had well-off parents who were simply anxious to keep the birth secret, the single fee might be as much as £80. £50 might be negotiated if the father of the child wanted to keep his identity safe. Sadly, the majority of the young women were from poor backgrounds. These women were charged a lot less, such as £10. In 1870, £10 would be about £850 in today's money. Some carers resorted to starving the farmed-out babies. They did this to save money and even to hasten death. Many babies were noisy, so they were sedated with alcohol or opiates. Jeffrey's cordial, better known by its common name, Mother's Friend, was a syrup containing opium which would be given to babies. Many children died as a result of these medicines, and in the Victorian times, opium killed far more infants through starvation than directly through overdose. This was because when a baby is continually fed opium, they would not want to eat and die from malnutrition. This meant that when a coroner would produce a death certificate, they were most likely to record the death as debility from birth or lack of breast milk or simply starvation. Mothers who wanted to see their babies or whose circumstances had changed and wanted to reclaim their child could often encounter difficulties, and many would be too frightened or ashamed to tell the police about any suspected wrongdoing. Even the authorities often had problems tracing any children that were reported missing. This was the world opened up to Amelia. She had to leave nursing due to the birth of her daughter, Ellen Thomas. Then in 1869, her husband George Thomas died and Amelia needed an income. Amelia decided that baby farming could help her make money, especially as she had trained as a nurse. So she advertised to nurse and adopt babies in return for a substantial one-off payment and adequate clothing for the child. In her advertisements and meetings with clients, she assured them that she was respectable, married, and that she would provide a safe and loving home for the child. At some point in her baby farming career, Amelia was prepared to forego the expense and inconvenience of letting the children die for neglect and starvation. And soon after receipt of each child, she murdered them, thus allowing her to pocket most or all of the entire fee. Amelia Dyer evaded any police investigation for a long time until she was eventually caught in 1879 after a doctor was suspicious about the number of child deaths he had been called to certify in her care. Strangely though, she was not convicted of murder or manslaughter, but instead sentenced to 6 months hard labor for neglect. After serving her 6-month sentence, she had spells in mental hospitals due to her alleged mental instability. These always, however, coincided with times when it was convenient for her to disappear. Being a former asylum nurse, Amelia knew how to behave to ensure a relatively comfortable existence in an asylum. It appears that Amelia began abusing alcohol and opium-based products early in her killing career. Her mental instability could have been related to her substance abuse. In 1890, Amelia cared for the illegitimate baby of a governess. When the governess returned to visit her baby, she became suspicious and stripped the baby to see if a birthmark was present on its hips. It wasn't. The governess reported this to the authorities. And when the authorities started to investigate, Amelia drank 2 bottles of laudanum in a serious suicide attempt, but her long-term abuse had built up a tolerance to opium products, so she survived and was not prosecuted due to lack of evidence. Of course, she returned to baby farming and murder. Amelia decided that she did not want to involve doctors to issue death certificates and began disposing of the bodies herself. Precarious nature and extent of her activities again prompted undesirable attention. She was alert to the attentions of the police and of parents seeking to reclaim their children. She and her family frequently relocated to different towns and cities to escape suspicion, regain anonymity, and to acquire new business. Over the years, Amelia used many different identities. In 1895, Amelia moved to Caversham, Berkshire, accompanied by an unsuspecting associate, J. Granny Smith, whom Amelia had recruited from a brief spell in a workhouse, and Amelia's daughter, Mary, and also known as Polly, and her son-in-law, Arthur Palmer. This was followed by a move to Kensington Road, Reading, Berkshire, later the same year. Smith was persuaded by Amelia to be referred to as mother, in front of innocent women handing over their children. This was an effort to present a caring mother-daughter image. In January 1896, a 25-year-old barmaid named Evelina Marmon gave birth to an illegitimate daughter, Doris, in a boarding house in Cheltenham. She was unable to raise the child alone, so saw offers of adoption and placed an advertisement in that miscellaneous section of the Bristol Times and Mirror newspaper. It simply read, "Wanted respectable woman to take young child." Evelina intended to go back to work and hoped eventually to reclaim her child. The advertisement next to her own was one placed by Amelia Dyer, which read, "Married couple with no family would adopt healthy child, nice country home. Terms £10. Evelina responded to a Mrs. Harding, and a few days later she received a reply from Amelia from Oxford Road in Reading. Mrs. Harding wrote, "I should be glad to have a dear little baby girl, one I could bring up and call my own." She continued, "We are a plain, homely people in fairly good circumstances. I don't want a child for money's sake, but for company and home comfort. Myself and my husband are dearly fond of children. I have no child of my own. A child with me will have a good home and a mother's love." Evelina Marmon wanted to pay a more affordable weekly fee for the care of her daughter, but Mrs. Harding insisted on being given the one-off payment in advance. Evelina was not in a very good social or economic position, so she reluctantly agreed to pay the £10, and a week later Mrs. Harding arrived in Cheltenham. Evelina was surprised by Amelia's advanced age and appearance, but Amelia seemed affectionate towards Doris. Evelina handed over her daughter, together with a cardboard box of clothes and the £10. She was very upset at having to give up care of her daughter and accompanied Amelia to Chatham Station. She returned to her lodgings very emotional at having to give up her baby daughter. A few days later, she received a letter from Mrs. Harding saying all was well. Evelina wrote back but received no reply. However, Amelia Dyer had not traveled where she had told Evelina she was going. Instead, she had gone to 76 Mayo Road, Willesden, London, where her 23-year-old daughter Polly was staying. There, Amelia found some white edging tape, using dressmaking, wound it twice around the baby's neck and tied a knot and murdered her. Amelia and her daughter Polly allegedly helped to wrap the body in a napkin. They kept some of the clothes Evelina had packed and sold the rest to the local pawnbroker. Amelia paid the rent to her landlady and gave her a pair of child boots as a present for her little girl. The following day, Wednesday the 1st of April 1896, another child named Harry Simmons was taken to Mayo Road. However, with no spare white edging tape available, the tape around Doris' corpse was removed and used to strangle the 13-month-old boy. On April 2nd, both bodies were stacked into a carpet bag along with bricks for added weight. Amelia then headed for Reading. At a selected spot she knew well, near Caversham Lock, she forced the carpet bag through railings into the River Thames. 3 days before, on the 30th of March, 1896, a package was retrieved from the Thames at Reading by a bargeman. It contained the body of a baby girl, later identified as Helena Fry. The package was given to Reading Borough Police, who found a label from the Templemead Station, Bristol. With microscopic analysis of the wrapping paper, deciphered a faintly legible name, Mrs. Thomas, and an address. The evidence led police to Amelia Dyer, but they still had no strong evidence to connect her directly with any involvement with the baby in the river. The police decided to put Amelia under surveillance. The police used a young woman as a decoy, hoping she would be able to secure a meeting with Amelia to discuss her services. A meeting was arranged for April the 3rd, Good Friday, but instead of the decoy turning up, it was the Reading police who arrived at Amelia's house. When searching her home, they were apparently struck by the stench of human decomposition. Although no human remains were found in the house, plenty of other related evidence, including white edging tape, telegrams regarding adoption arrangements, porn tickets for children's clothing, receipts for advertisements, and letters from mothers inquiring about the well-being of their children. Previous few months alone, at least 20 children had been placed in the care of Mrs. Thomas, now revealed to be Amelia Dyer. It also appeared that she was about to move home again, this time to Somerset. This rate of murder has led some to estimate that Mrs. Dyer may, over the course of decades, have killed over 400 babies and children, making her one of the most prolific murderers ever. It is believed that Amelia arrived home carrying a brown paper parcel. She hid the package in the house, but after 3 weeks of odor and decomposition prompted her to dump the dead baby in the river. As it was not weighed adequately, it had been easily spotted. Amelia was arrested on April 4th and charged with murder. Her son-in-law, Arthur Palmer, was charged as an accessory. During April, the Thames was dredged and 6 more bodies were discovered, including Doris Marmon, Harry Simmons, Amelia's last victims. Each baby had been strangled with white tape. 11 days after handing her daughter to Amelia Dyer, Evelina Marmon, whose name had emerged in items kept by Amelia, identified her daughter's remains. At the inquest into the deaths in early May, no evidence was found that Mary Ann or Arthur Palmer had acted as Amelia Dyer's accomplices. Arthur Palmer was discharged as a result of a confession written by Amelia Dyer. On the 22nd of May, 1896, Amelia Dyer appeared at the Old Bailey and pleaded guilty to one murder, that of Doris Marmon. Her family and associates testified at her trial. They had been growing suspicious and uneasy about her activities, and it emerged that she had narrowly escaped discovery on several occasions. Evidence from a man who had seen and spoken to her when she had disposed of 2 bodies in Caversham Loch also proved significant. Also, her own daughter had given graphic evidence that ensured Amelia Dyer's conviction. The only defense Amelia Dyer offered was insanity. She had been twice committed to asylums in Bristol. However, the prosecution argued successfully that her mental instability had been a ploy to avoid suspicion. Both committals were said to have coincided with times when Amelia was concerned her crimes might have been exposed. It took the jury only 4.5 minutes to find her guilty. In her 3 weeks in a condemned cell, she filled 5 exercise books with her last true confession. She was visited the night before her execution by a chaplain and asked if she had anything to confess. She offered him her exercise book, saying, "Isn't this enough?" Amelia Dyer was hanged at Newgate Prison on Wednesday, June 10, 1896. Asked on the scaffold if she had anything to say, she said, "I have nothing to say." It is uncertain how many more children Amelia Dyer murdered. However, inquiries from mothers, evidence of other witnesses, and material found in Amelia's homes, including letters and many babies' clothes, pointed to many more. The Amelia Dyer case caused a scandal in Victorian Britain, and she became known as the Ogres of Reading. Subsequently, adoption laws in Britain were made stricter, giving local authorities the power to police baby farms in the hope of stamping out abuse. Despite this and the scrutinizing of newspapers' personal ads, the trafficking and abuse of infants did not stop. 2 years after Amelia Dyer's execution, railway workers inspecting carriages at Newton Abbot, Devon, found a parcel. Inside was a 3-week-old girl. She was cold and wet, but she was alive. A lady named Jane Hill had given the baby to a Mrs. Stewart for £12. Mrs. Stewart had picked up the baby in Plymouth and apparently dumped her on the next train. It is claimed that Mrs. Stewart was Polly, the daughter of Amelia Dyer. Today I'm going to be taking you back 300 years to Georgian England, where we will be looking at the horrific crimes of Catherine Hayes. Catherine was one of the last women in England to be charged with petty treason before this charge was abolished and simply reclassified as murder. In Britain, the Georgian period was between 1714 and 1830, and this crime was committed very early in the Georgian period in 1725, so nearly 300 years ago, and 104 years before the Metropolitan Police Act of 1829 established a full-time professional police force in London. It was considered that in Georgian Britain, men were more valuable in law than women. So if a woman killed her husband, she was guilty not merely of murder, but the much more serious crime of petty treason. Petty treason was defined by the Treason Act of 1351 and encompassed the killing of a master by a servant, a husband by his wife, or a superior by his inferior. These crimes were seen both as an assault on the majesty of the state as well as the actual victim, and were perceived at the time to be against the natural order of things. This meant that the punishment for petty treason was much more severe than for ordinary murder. Women were burned at the stake, and men could be hanged, drawn, and quartered, these also being the respective punishments for high treason. Catherine was born in Birmingham, England in 1690. When she was 15 years old, she ran away from home. As a 15-year-old in 1705, it was difficult to survive. But Catherine was a very pretty girl and found her way into prostitution. She was employed to look after the needs of a group of army officers in Worcestershire. But after a while, they tired of her services. She spent the next few years working in prostitution, or when she could, as a maid in domestic service. Catherine had a relationship with a local tanner and gave birth to a son named Thomas. At the age of 23, she secured a position as a housemaid to a local gentleman farmer named Hayes. Mr. Hayes had 2 sons, and it didn't take long for Catherine to seduce the older one. He was 21-year-old John. John fell for Catherine, and they married in secret and started living in a cottage on his father's farm. For the first 6 months of the marriage, it seemed to go quite well. John was working long hours on the farm where Catherine was at home. Catherine, however, needed to amuse herself, so she started to have relationships with other men. The couple lived a very rural life on the farm, which is very different to Catherine's childhood in the city of Birmingham. In 1719, Catherine persuaded John to move to London. This they did, and John set up a business as a coal merchant, pawnbroker, and moneylender. The business did very well, and Catherine was given a generous allowance, including servants. This, however, was not enough to satisfy her, and she constantly asked John for more. He was growing tired of his wife's demands, and decided she was spending too much money, so reduced her allowance. By the year 1725, the marriage began to go downhill. Coincidentally, at the same time, the couple had taken in a lodger who was a young tailor, 18-year-old Thomas Billings, who was, in fact, Catherine's illegitimate son. She started to have an incestuous affair with Thomas. They then took in another lodger, also called Thomas Wood, who was a friend of Catherine's husband John and was a butcher by trade. It was not long before Catherine was also having a relationship with him. So now, to put it into context, living in the house we have Catherine, her husband John, Catherine's illegitimate son, Thomas Billings, a tailor, and Thomas Wood, who was a butcher. Catherine decided that she no longer wanted to be married to her husband. She could have left him. Nevertheless, in Georgia and Britain, this would mean giving up all of the luxuries and comfortable life she had become accustomed to leading. Instead, she decided she would have to kill him. Using all of her charms, she persuaded the 2 lodgers to help her end her husband's life. On the 1st of March, 1725, John went out drinking to a local pub with the 2 lodgers, and they took bets on who could drink the most and remain sober. When they all got home, Catherine's husband John was very drunk, so he went to bed. When he was finally asleep, Thomas Billings, Catherine's illegitimate son, entered his bedroom and hit John on the head with an axe. John let out screams, which were heard by the lady who rented the rooms above. Her name was Mrs. Springate. She immediately came down to inquire about the noise. But Catherine told her they'd been having a party, and Mrs. Springate returned to her room. Thomas Wood then helped Thomas Billings finish off John with the axe. They all decided that it would be best to ensure that John's body was unidentifiable. So they cut off his head and wrapped it in a cloth. They then put it in a bucket. As Thomas Wood was a butcher, he sliced up the rest of John's body. They then had to get rid of the evidence, so waited until it was dark and removed a sliced-up body from the house. They took it to a nearby pond in Marleybone Fields. They then went to Millbank and threw the head into the River Thames. Their plan, however, was not well thought out, and they had not made sure that the head sunk to the bottom of the river. So it was soon recovered by local boatmen who in horror reported his findings to the constable. It was taken to be examined, where the skull was found to be severely fractured in 2 places and the face terribly cut. Nobody could identify John's severed head, so it was placed on top of a wooden spike in St. Margaret's churchyard. Despite its appearance, it didn't take long for the head to be identified by 3 men as being that of John Hayes. One of the men who had identified John was a business associate named Mr. Ashby, who informed Catherine that he had been due to meet John to discuss some business, and John did not show up at the appointment or send word that he would not be there. Catherine insisted that her husband had been called away on urgent business. She was getting agitated, and this time she made up a story about John having killed a man in a fight and fleeing the country. Mr. Ashby didn't believe the story, so reported his suspicions to the authorities. In consequence of voicing his suspicions, Mr. Ashby returned to the Hayes household with several constables. When they arrived, to their surprise, they discovered Catherine in bed with Thomas Billings. The pair were both immediately arrested. Thomas Wood had temporarily escaped, but for some reason returned to London a few days later, where he too was arrested. The remains of John's body were later discovered on the 26th of March. The authorities also decided to arrest Mrs. Springate, although they soon realized that she had no part in the crime and was released. A coroner's inquest opened on the 16th of April, 1726 to investigate John's death. It brought in a verdict of willful murder, naming Catherine, Thomas Wood, and Thomas Billings as the people responsible. This was a very barbaric crime which shook early 18th century London and was widely reported in the newspapers and spoken about in the streets. The case was of special interest because it was one of the first recorded instances where a victim had been dismembered after death. The magistrate showed Catherine her husband's head. by now preserved in a jar of gin, and invited her to touch it. At the time, there was a superstition that if a murderer touched the head of the victim, their guilt would be revealed. Catherine, being aware of this, was quite happy to touch John's head and put on a show of grief for the magistrate. However, she was remanded in Newgate prison until her trial. Billings and Wood were kept separately from Catherine, and her illegitimate son Thomas continued to protest his innocence. When Thomas Wood had been arrested, he was cross-examined by the justices of the peace and confessed to his part in the crime, implicating Catherine and Billings. He told the justice that Catherine had given he and Billings the money to get her husband drunk and that Billings had struck the fatal blow while he had cut up the body. Catherine then also confessed her guilt and said that the devil had been in them and made them commit murder. 3 came to trial at the April sessions of the Old Bailey in London, held between Wednesday 20th and Saturday, April 23rd. Before the Lord Mayor, the Recorder, and several other judges. The indictment against Catherine was for petty treason. Thomas Billings and Thomas Wood were simply charged with murder. Catherine maintained that she had not taken part in the actual killing, but held a candle for the men while they dismembered her husband. She also continued to maintain that the crime was the work of the devil through them. They were tried by a jury of 12 men who heard evidence of the murder, and they returned a verdict of guilty against all 3 defendants. Billings and Wood were sentenced to be hanged at Tyburn and afterwards to be hanged in chains, and Catherine, having been found guilty of petty treason, was sentenced to be drawn to Tyburn on a hurdle, and there be burned alive at the stake. She was greatly distressed by her sentence, as were her 2 co-defendants who begged just to be hanged. Catherine and her fellow condemned were lodged in the condemned hold at Newgate prison, where she reaffirmed her confession but protested for severity of her sentence. She accepted that she deserved to die for her crimes, but very distressed by the thought of the way she would be executed. The executions were set for Monday the 9th of May, 1726, and drew the usual huge crowd, particularly as a woman was to be burnt. In the press yard at Newgate that day there were 9 men and Catherine waiting to be executed. Their irons were removed, and the yeoman of the halter put the nooses around the men's necks prior to loading them in the carts, where they sat on their coffins for the journey to Tyburn. When they reached Tyburn, the 3 carts were backed under the beams, and the hangman secured each man in turn. When they finished their prayers, the carts were moved from under them, leaving them suspended. Catherine was of course able to watch the men die, one of which was her son, Thomas Billings. Attention now turned to her execution. She was secured to a stake set in the ground a few yards from the gallows. The cord put around her neck and passed through a hole bored in the stake for the purpose of strangling her in accordance with the normal practice of the time. 2 cartloads of sticks were piled around her, and at the signal the fire was lit. She begged the executioner to strangle her before the fire reached her, and he took the end of the cord and began to pull on it, but the flames blew in his direction, burning his hands, so he had to let go. Catherine reportedly gave 3 dreadful shrieks before she was engulfed by the fierce fire and fell silent. She was seen trying to push away the flames with her free hands, but to no avail. Reports claimed that the executioner, seeing her suffering, threw a large piece of wood at her head, which broke her skull and probably killed her. However, she would have suffered terrible burns and shot, and have been in horrific pain for some time before the fire or lack of oxygen created by it would have killed her. It was over an hour before her body was reduced to ashes. There is no memorial stone for Catherine Hayes. She goes down in history as a cold-blooded murderer who was burnt at a stake for the crime of killing her husband.